So I'm Isabelle from C.R.O.W.N Consulting. Today we'll be talking about the Human Resources Audit, the Personnel File Edition. This presentation will be derived from a checklist that we have already. So we'll be sending that out along with the presentation so that you can cross-reference. Okay. So for our agenda, we will be going over some departments first: the Community Care Licensing, the Regional Center, the Department of Labor, and Cal-OSHA. Those are for, at least from us, those will be for documents that you may need on hand or documents you should be submitting within your facilities so that you're ready should you need to submit anything to these departments, or should you, like if they come to do a visit for you, that way you already have that information ready to go. And then we'll be talking about the personnel files. So just some reminders: the employee orientation records, the performance records, training records, separation records, and then what should not be in the personnel file itself, but what should be filed separately in a confidential file. So community care licensing, your licenses should be easily accessible in a location within your facility. The licenses should also remain current. The best way to do this is, of course, keeping reminders, keeping a good calendar. That way you're not missing any deadlines. Of course, because everything can get overwhelming. My favorite way to do things is to have reminders a week out or a month out so that it's on my radar. So I'm presently thinking about it until the due date comes up. The owner should also, since you are the people who are obtaining this license, you should also be keeping it somewhere in a secure location where others may not be able to get to it, or it's not easily accessible just by anybody who's coming into the facility. And then keeping your facility up to code always in case of a visit, planned or unplanned. I know the slide says surprise, but I mean planned or unplanned. So yeah. For the regional center, having an accurate record of employees who are in their classifications for exempt and non-exempt is very important. Employees should also be performing duties within their job scope. So this is for their title and their description. Those things should match up so that they're doing the appropriate work for their role. You want to make sure that you're also keeping time tracking records accurate for employees, especially for those who are doing overtime, and especially for people who have maybe concerns about overtime. This way you can pull it up and you can check, and they can look at it as well with you so that you know who's maybe hitting those overtime hours and who's not. When you're reporting an incident to the regional center, the best thing to do is to over communicate those details, making sure that you're taking down notes or whatever is necessary, and then making sure those reports are submitted on time or in a timely fashion, whether it is the incident reports or any other information that they may need from you. And once again, keeping your facility up to code in case of those planned or unplanned visits. So for the Department of Labor, excuse me, sorry. Okay. The Department of Labor, the complaints that they usually receive are pay related. So as the owner, it would be best to be proactive instead of reactive, making sure that, oh,
sorry.
It's okay. Making sure that you are paying employees appropriately, making sure that people are, especially if they're doing overtime, you want to make sure that they're getting paid that time and a half. Again, going back to keeping your payroll records very thorough so that you know who is in what classification, but also if somebody's reaching that overtime limit, that they're actually being paid in that overtime capacity. Okay. Oh, sorry. One more thing about the Department of Labor is that sometimes the complaints can be time consuming. So it's best to have all of your documentation and your information ready to go so that you can send it off in case you receive those complaints in. Last one here will be for Cal OSHA. Of course, keeping your facility safe is always the first priority. Um, e Having when an accident occurs, you just want to make sure that you're reporting that immediately. On the slide, we've included the website to Cal OSHA that you can use as your resource. And then also I've included another link that'll show you directly, according to your district, who you can call, just because everybody is in different locations. And this way you have access to the right person. And then of course, reporting it immediately will reduce the chances of forgetting any details, forgetting anything that happened in between the time of maybe when the report occurred and later on. So yeah. Moving into the personnel file now, just some reminders. First is that the files should all be placed in a cabinet in the office of the owner or somewhere within the facility. Doesn't have to be that specific office, but it should be somewhere that has a cabinet that locks and then a door that locks. In this way, you just mitigate risk of anybody coming in there and just opening up drawers and finding all these personnel files. There is a difference between a confidential file and a personnel file. We will touch on that towards the end of the presentation. You want to make sure that your files are filed in a system of your choosing. So the example I've put on the slide is to make sure that they're filed alphabetically by last name. It can be however works for you. It could be by department, it could be by first name, including a checklist for the files to ensure that all information is contained within. This way you're not missing anything, but if you are, you can cross-reference it rather than just flipping through a bunch of pages because it can be overwhelming. Employees may also review their files and make copies from their own personnel file. However, there has to be a manager or a supervisor. If you have an HR team, one person has to be present with them just so that so that you can make sure that they're not going through anybody else's files or trying to find anything else somewhere else and just snooping around. And then of course you want to make sure that you're not removing anything from anybody's personnel file. This includes like anything from like expired training certificates, maybe some vaccination records, just because you may need that information once again, but it's also best to use it as a reference in case you need to check if everybody hasn't done the most recent training. Maybe somebody has, but like 15 other people have not. So this way you can use that. But it also shows an employee's history, and you can kind of use it as like a fun artifact sometimes. So, yeah. So the first section in your personnel file should be your employment and orientation records, just your applications, the resumes that they have, their offer letters, which are usually their conditional offer letters. The job description is very important in case somebody would like to see it again. Confidentiality, non-compete, and other employee agreements. New hire checklist, appointment and onboarding forms. Those can be like your direct deposit form or anything else that's specific to you. I'm forgetting other examples right now. Your handbook acknowledgement forms with the latest revision date. That way you know the last time that person has read a handbook, or maybe it was back in 2016. Drug testing policy and acknowledgement form. This is just to make sure that you know that they were aware that if you're doing drug testing, that they are also aware they did it, so it's in their file. Same with the background check consent, to make sure that they are aware that they knew that they were participating in this. Also, adding reference checks and employment verification, if you have those. Your pay rate changes should also be documented. This can be put into a personnel action form. But if you do not have one of those, it just needs to be documented. That way they know, you know, if somebody's rate went from $19 to $20, it was documented on this date. And that way moving forward, everybody is aware of that information, at least within the file. So if a supervisor needs it, they can read that as well. An example of this is if the transaction is communicated via email, you can always print that email out and then place it into the file as well. The next section should be performance records. This includes your performance evaluations, disciplinary warnings and performance improvement plans, notes that were around any verbal counseling or discipline that you've done, of course, awards for recognition for a great job, anything like maybe a certificate for that as well. And then you want to make sure that you have an established performance review cycle. This can be annually, biannually, but this can also include if you're doing a review cycle after the probationary period. So if you have a 90-day probation period and you need to do a review, you want to make sure that's also in this section. Training records should be your first aid trainings, your sexual harassment trainings, anything that's related to the program itself, new hire safety trainings, job specific safety trainings, and then a harassment training acknowledgement. You want to make sure that's going in here so that people are aware that they're going to be participating in the training, so that they're not just saying, oh, well, I didn't know we were going to have sexual harassment training. They just sprung it on me. Having that acknowledgement will reduce that amount of the risk of having that complaint go out. Lastly, your separation records should also be in the personnel file. This includes the resignation letter or your termination letter, notes about the reason for the separation or the termination for that employee, an exit interview, and if they decline to have an exit interview, that should also be in here, a separation checklist that kind of goes over, okay, this person's last day, they got their last check, maybe they are returning equipment, if you've issued out equipment, things like that should all be in there. Unemployment documents, so if they have left the company, they've filed EDD, and EDD sends you that paper, you want to make sure that you have a record of that document that you've gotten from EDD in their file so that if you ever need to reference it again, it's in that file. The separation agreement, any post-termination correspondence, so if somebody is emailing or contacting you about maybe they forgot a check or maybe they forgot to return a charger, you want to make sure that's all documented as well, just for your safety and for records keeping purposes. And then lastly, a reference release form and reference statements. So that is about if somebody wants to use the organization as a reference going forward, you can issue a statement to the new job that maybe they're applying to say, yes, this person was here, this is their job title, their rate of pay, this was their duties, and so on. Sorry, just gonna drink some water. Okay. And lastly, what should be filed separately, also known as your confidential file, the I-9 forms and any copies of identification, so passports, California IDs, driver's license, birth certificates, things like that. Any investigation notes and reports should also be filed separately. Drug tests and background check results should be outside of the personnel file. Again, because if something happens in a file, you would rather it be locked up in a separate place than in access to all the employees' folders. Any payroll records containing social security numbers and other protected information, medical records that come in from anybody, from any doctors or anything. And then lastly, again, just reemphasizing confidential records that have any sensitive or protected information. So dates of birth, social securities, maybe addresses if people have moved or things like that. You just want to make sure that those things are locked away in a separate drawer from the drawer with all of the files in it. I know I went through that very quickly, but that is the end of the presentation. Again, our contact emails are on the slide. If you need to ask any other questions or any follow-ups.
I have a question.
Okay.
Sure.
Can you explain to us the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees, and what would classify an employee or a person as a contractor versus classifying them as an employee?
Okay, so essentially an exempt employee is a management or a salaried employee. That's an exempt employee. A non-exempt employee is an hourly employee. And so a lot of it has to do with like their scope of work. If they supervise, if they manage, you have to be really clear when you want to classify someone as exempt versus non-exempt. So a non-exempt employee earns overtime. So if someone is an hourly employee, they after, then this is just generally because I know that in the facilities, depending on how the employee is scheduled, they earn overtime based on, their schedule, and there's other parameters that determine overtime. But generally, if you work more than 8 hours in a day or more than 40 hours in a week, you earn overtime. So, but I know that there are caveats. So we just want to be sure that employees are classified appropriately. Because, as Isabelle talked about, that's where you get in the claims to the Department of Labor that they're not classified appropriately. And it's also why you want to be sure that employees are working within their scope and they're not working outside of their job scope. Your other question was about
the other question was about classifying, contractor versus employee status, especially within the scope of, say, ILS and SLS.
Okay, so again, I'm just speaking in general terms. A contractor is someone who doesn't work for your organization, right? So they're not an employee. So an employee is someone who's on your payroll. So if you are paying them either as an exempt employee or non-exempt employee, they are not a contractor. So a contractor is someone who is either a sole proprietor or an LLC or something like that is working with you, but they don't work for you. They work for themselves. And you can 1099 them as a contractor for work that they perform with your organization, but they're not your employee.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
You all have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you the next HR session.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.